Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. Coming up on the programme this week.
Why do people self-harm? Generally because they're trying to cope with some kind of emotional distress. And as we've seen, certainly within our data, young people are experiencing more stress, more anxieties, more specific mental health disorders such as eating disorders.
Often they talk about, the word of the year, and I think last year it was pandemic or furlough or something like that. Would be great. The word of the year for 2021 and beyond was empathy.
We've seen real increases in adults reporting abuse within their home environment. That doesn't just go away because the world has opened up again. So mental health services like Kooth, like the NHS, are now having to pick up those pieces.
And I'll be reminding you how you can make connections with mental health organisations within your community. It's Mental Health Monday. Hey everybody, welcome to Mental Health Monday. Once again, we're here to have conversations about mental health in a fair, frank and honest way. And we've got a brilliant guest on the programme who is the Chief Clinical Officer at Kooth. Kooth.com is a mental health platform that works right across the UK. Every year they produce a State of the Nation report, their Pulse report, which basically looks at all the data that they've received and sort of maps it all out, plots it all out and gives us a real picture and a real clear picture of where we're at from a mental health point of view. So that conversation is on the way. So many people have been talking about like the impact of lockdown on our mental health, but this is actual data that kind of tells you what it is. So if you work within mental health, I guess this is going to be pretty useful to see the trends that are on at the moment. And of course, things are changing all the time as lockdown is easing, as we're sort of at the moment, we've just headed out of the latest period, which means you can now go into people's houses. That was great for us because on the day of easing, May the 17th, was actually my little lad's birthday, which meant he could actually have his grandma come round on his birthday. And he's only 3. So that's the first birthday that, he can remember where he was actually with his family. Last year, of course, we were very much in lockdown, unable to do pretty much anything at all. Whether he remembers it or not, I'm not quite so sure, but it was certainly nice to have an occasion that as a family we could all enjoy. Even went out for an ice cream and actually sat indoors and ate it. I couldn't believe it. So thank you to everybody joining in conversations. The Mental Health Monday Facebook group is getting nice and busy as well. Loads of different organisations doing various things. If you're part of an organisation that wants to talk about what you're doing and you want to mention on the group, drop that in on Facebook. Just look for Mental Health Monday. I'm the admin. I just let everybody in anyway, so don't worry about that. And then we can promote various things that we're doing. That's on the Mental Health Monday group. Let's get those conversations going too. As ever, I hope you're well. Thanks for checking out the podcast. And if you're able to tell your friends on social media that you've been listening, that will be wonderful too. Hashtag Mental Health Monday. You can tag me in it as well. Right, going to crack on with the conversation. Before I do that, though, I just want to mention that just ahead of speaking to you now, I'm in my final preparations to take part in the Mental Health Football Association event, which is taking place in Liverpool on Saturday, the 22nd of May. So by the time you listen to this, it will have already happened. Now, I'm due to be playing in the All-Stars team. So I'll be honest with you now, speaking ahead of the event. I've not played football sort of in groups of people for a very long time. But also, and I've not mentioned this to other people, I've been trying to get a little bit fitter as well. So since about February, I've been doing sort of regular runs to try and get a little bit active. So fingers crossed it's going to go okay. I'll be absolutely honest. I am dead nervous and I've got some serious sort of anxiety build up in regard to it because I'm worried that I'm just going to make an absolute fool of myself or people are going to think I'm rubbish or that I don't have the right kit or anything like that. But by the time you're listening to this, it will have happened. And I know that when it happens, it'll be absolutely fine. It's just that apprehension beforehand. Colin Dolan has set that up, by the way, the Mental Health Football Association event. Fingers crossed it all goes according to plan. Hopefully I'll mention it on a future podcast episode as well. Right, let's get on with the conversation. Dr. Lynne Green, Chief Clinical Officer for Kooth, and the issues facing the nation set out by the Pulse report, which judges the state of the nation when it comes to our mental health.
Yeah, that's right. So our service has been around for about 20 years. So you can imagine we've got loads and loads of data. And what we've done with the State of the Nation report is looked at the data from the start of the pandemic, so April last year, 2020, right through to March this year. And we've compared it specifically to the period the year before. And yeah, really with a view to just sharing some of the insights into the impact of the the pandemic. The data is based on around about 200,000 users, just slightly under, and the age range is from 10 upwards. So yeah, it creates a really interesting story, actually.
And it tells a story of people having a really, really difficult, I almost say year, but of course it's longer than a year now that people have been within this period. But the reporting period that you have has been difficult right across different age groups, different backgrounds, different types of people, you name it, it's been a difficult year.
Yeah, it has. As our data shows, we've seen increases in presenting issues and mental health issues right across the board, from the really youngies, so the sort of 13s and under, right through to older adults. So yeah, I'd be really keen to share some of our insights with you.
Can we start with the young people between the ages of 10 and 13? I noted through the reports a 33% increase in self-harm, 54% increase in suicidal thoughts. That's children between the ages of 10 and 13 with suicidal thoughts. I mean, that's a shocking stat. What's the reality of that in terms of the human side of that story?
Yeah, it's a real worry, isn't it? I think, first of all, I would stress that there is a difference between suicidality and completed suicide, and certainly at the moment suicide rates per se have remained stable, but nevertheless that increase that you described in suicidal thoughts in this age group is really worrying. And if you look at the NHS data around tier 4 inpatient admissions, they've massively increased over the last year and actually prior to the pandemic. So specifically in this age range in relation to chronic self-harm and suicidal thoughts. So I think our data and that data, really does paint a worrying picture. Why this age group? I think it's really tricky. I don't think we have a definitive answer. I think we need more data, we need more research, but certainly I would say that mental health generally, we've been seeing a sort of downward age shift in mental health presentations, just generally, and actually related behaviours, cannabis use, for example. Some people are seeing cannabis use as the sort of next big crisis in terms of children's mental health, because children as young as 12 and 12 to 14 start to sort of dabble with cannabis, right down to actually 7 and 8. So I think it's really important that we understand self-harm and suicidality in the wider context of mental health. I would say, and obviously self-harm and suicide are complex, and I don't want to oversimplify these phenomena, but why do people self-harm? Generally because they're trying to cope with some kind of emotional distress. And as we've seen, certainly within our data, young people are experiencing more stress, more anxieties, more specific mental health disorders such as eating disorders. So it sort of paints a picture of why we might be seeing people turning to coping mechanisms like self-harm. I think for me, one of the most concerning stats in our whole report is around loss of aspiration and motivation for young people. That's increased by 115%. This really saddens me, because having that sense of positivity, hope for the future and what it might bring, is just so important in our youngsters. Many of them are just not feeling it at the moment. They've been really adversely affected. So I think as parents, as mental health workers and leaders, as teachers, and just society in general, we've got a lot of work to do, really, to start trying to kind of rebuild that sense of hope and positivity for our young people.
It's really concerning, isn't it, that stat there, which sets out just how difficult young people are seeing, not just themselves now, but almost like when they're trying to imagine their future, they're struggling to get their heads around that. And I guess people would be concerned that would play out into self-harm or suicidal thoughts or thoughts of suicide. Because I guess people would think, well, do children not have somewhere to go? Is there not an inbuilt resilience? Now, obviously, that resilience can take you so far, but obviously it's not quite strong enough to get you far enough. And I guess that's a measure of how difficult the year has been.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you think about suicide and suicidality and sort of what leads people to that point. And again, it's really complex, but hopelessness, having that, lack of hope about what the future may bring, is one of the most central sort of signs and risk factors for completed suicide. And sadly, many of our young people are describing exactly that to us. I agree. I think young people are incredibly resilient. And certainly the people we work with do show incredible resilience, but it's so important that they have somewhere to go. That's why our service is, or one of the reasons why our service is anonymous, because we really want to encourage people to come and talk to us early, no matter how big or small their problem is, because, even people don't just wake up one day and suddenly feel suicidal. There's a real gradual build up to this presentation, and we really want to try and get to people early so we can help them and help them with some positive strategies.
Can I, in terms of the last year, particularly for that 10 to 13 year sort of age group, where there was that disjointed, there was the no school, the home school, but then there was that period of people returning to school, and then a relatively normal summer before things really started to escalate towards the end of the year. Were there peaks and troughs in that time? Was that summer a positive time for young people? Was there a sense that the good times were potentially coming back, or did that compound the misery, if you like, when things essentially got worse again?
I think it was a real mixed picture. Certainly our data presents a real mixed picture. For many people, being at home, not having to go into school was quite a positive thing. Some children really liked the flexibility that brought, and for other children, it was absolutely horrendous. Losing their routine, not seeing their friends, was really, really difficult for them. But one of the increases that we saw was concerns around family relationships. So both from the parent point of view and the child point of view, because obviously people were sort of forced into, being at home with their family for longer periods than they were used to. So certainly a mixed picture. Interestingly, right at the start of the pandemic, which was around about Easter time, we normally expect to see a real increase in concerns around exams and school-related stuff as the pressure starts to sort of build in the lead up to summer, and we didn't see it. And of course, it's because it was, children weren't at school and exams were being cancelled. So we didn't see the normal increase. But gradually, as we moved through the pandemic, we started to see real concerns for people. Interestingly, we also saw a slight decrease in bullying issues as well, which raises some interesting questions, doesn't it, around sort of bullying within school.
Absolutely. Many of these issues, which young people are dealing with, it's great that you're able to get such specific data, because it gives a sense that you're able to identify a particular issue that a young person is dealing with, or the young person themselves is able to quantify and identify what it is that they're experiencing. But I did notice, as part of it, the stats, particularly around children and young adults, I think it's an 83% increase in reporting of sleep difficulties. And I imagine that sleep difficulties is a bit of a catch-all for various different problems, maybe that you've got to try and identify individually. But if someone's not sleeping properly, there's a sign there that there's something else going on. And I guess it's people like yourself, your job and your colleagues' job to work out what those wider issues are.
Yeah, exactly that. Sleep is an interesting one, and it has a really strong relationship with mental health, as you've suggested. So if somebody isn't sleeping well, then that's obviously going to affect their mental health. And conversely, if you have an existing mental health difficulty that isn't being adequately managed, then obviously that's going to affect your sleep as well. So it's a bit of a catch-22. If you look at the array of mental health presentations, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, the whole range, sleep will feature as one of the symptoms. So we are very alert to difficulties around sleep. And often it's like when people go to the GP, often people feel more able to tell you about something physical, whether it's back pain or a headache or a sore throat or sleep difficulties. And actually, when you delve a bit more into the difficulties, you actually uncover something far more complex in relation to mental health. So we're very alert to concerns about sleep.
I often think like a prescription of sleep would be like the tonic that the nation would often need. I think this is more born out of being denied sleep through either work patterns that I've had in the past or when I became a parent, that you realize what a controlling factor that is within your life, that if it's denied to you, fine, for one day we've all had a bit of a bad night's sleep and we've just about survived the next day. But if it's constant and ongoing, it creates these sort of medium and then long-term issues, which I think as a parent, I think it takes sort of a good few years to sort of get back into normal routines and get back into those sort of normal patterns. But I guess if there's also things that are denying you sleep in the first place, with your brain running at a million miles an hour over various different issues, it creates this cycle which perpetuates all the difficulties, and I imagine makes them considerably worse.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as a parent, I, doubly agree with what you've just said. It does take a while, I think, for your sort of body to get back into that normal routine. I think stress is an interesting one, isn't it? Because stress isn't a mental health difficulty per se, but if you think of mental health on a spectrum, then stress that isn't managed well is very likely to develop into a mental health difficulty, and vice versa, actually, a bit like sleep. And when people are stressed, obviously their mind, as you suggested, is sort of going round and round and round, worrying about things. It becomes really impossible for some people to get to sleep, or they fall asleep and then they start kind of waking up at intervals in the morning. And then, of course, when it's time to get up, they're just not well rested. So, yeah, sleep is hugely important when it comes to mental health.
Let's talk about working adults as well. We mentioned the word stress and anxiety, reported increases again. Sadness, sleep difficulties as well, reported in working adults. Self-harm and suicide appear again. And I guess as well, we talk about young people, working adults. We say working adults, furloughed adults, working at home adults, working at home and homeschooling adults. Adults who've been made redundant or have been looking for work in that time as well. It's been a real mixed bag and a time of real uncertainty, hasn't it, during the last 12 months?
Yeah, that's right. I think a bit like the children going back to school, it's been a mixed picture. Some adults have found the flexibility of remote working, not having to do the long commutes, being able to manage their day slightly better, have found that really welcomed and are actually really anxious about the return to work, whereas other adults have really, really struggled with that loss of routine, the loss of social contact. As you suggested, many people have been facing the threat of redundancy or have experienced that. And as they return to work, many have an ongoing concern about where they stand within their employment. So, and health anxiety as well, actually. Again, sort of at the start, and as we moved through last year, we saw huge increases in health anxieties. And of course, for many people, they were required to continue going into the workplace. Now, again, for some that will have been welcomed, for others, really concerning, not just for their own health, but for the health of sort of wider family members. So yeah, huge amounts of concern for our working age adults, as you mentioned. Sleep again, increased work-related stress, but also and particularly for those parents who were working at home and trying to hold down jobs whilst keeping an eye on the homeschooling. That created lots of stress, as you might imagine, and relationships became very strained within the family home.
I think that echoes a report from the Unite Union that said that they had, I think, an 83% increase in reporting of stress and anxiety through their reps. And I think that echoes what you've just talked about there. But the factors were sort of varied as well, not just obviously the way you work, but also the health concerns that people had. The idea of, well, am I returning to work too soon? Does my boss, does the management structure fully understand the implications? Another series of stats came out from USDOR, the shop workers union, attacks on shop workers, who of course are big key workers throughout this period of time, on the up as well. And again, there'll be a lot of people who are furloughed thinking, well, it's not great this because I don't know what the future is going to hold. There'll be a lot of people as well going, well, I've got to go in and I'm on the front line and I'm experiencing, the worst effects as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's some other interesting research that was carried out by the Chartered Management Institute, which is a partner of ours. They did a huge survey and found that nearly half of the people that they surveyed, the managers that they surveyed, believed that their mental health had been impacted as a result of the pandemic, but also a really significant number felt that the return to work had impacted or would impact their mental health even further, which is quite startling. And worryingly, only a small number reported that they would feel confident accessing the in-house support programs, the EAP programs. And that's concerning as well, because it suggests, I mean, maybe not completely surprising, but suggests that there is still quite a big stigma attached to mental health. And if you think about that stigma within the workplace, and as we've just identified, many people are worried about their job security, the thought of sort of going in with an added problem and being seen as the weak link at work is not very attractive to people. So it raises a real dilemma. Should people, we keep telling people you need to get early help, you need to speak out, but there's some very real anxieties about doing that.
Do you think in terms of the return to work or the return to school and college environments, universities the same, that there almost needs to be an official designated, almost like period of adjustment where, staff should feel empowered to say, you know what, I'm holding my hands up here. I can't do it today. This isn't going to work for me today. Because of course, our lives have changed a little bit, and school pickups and school drop-offs and childcare and all those things, looking after the dog and all of those things have kind of changed, that if they suddenly go, right, everybody, everyone's vaccinated, go back to work, there's a danger then that creates so many other problems that then has a longer term negative impact, that we almost need to have a period of flexibility as people find a new way of working, maybe.
I would actually go further than that and say it shouldn't just be a period of flexibility. It should be flexibility. We should really be thinking ahead to how leaders of organizations, to how they want their organizations to be, and to think about a sort of, a hybrid model, for example, where people may be able to work from home if that sort of better suits their circumstance. I think it's vitally important that, and all of us actually, but certainly leaders of organizations, really model good behaviors when it comes to mental health, and being open about that, and letting people know that it is okay to not be okay. I know within my organization, obviously we have lots of Zoom meetings, and sort of early on in the pandemic, you start the meeting asking everybody how they are, and everybody says yeah, I'm fine. And I used to go out of my way to say, it's so hard, I'm really struggling, and just to open up that conversation for people, because it is okay to not be okay. It is okay to struggle. So it's just so important, I think, that leaders do that. And if they haven't already put a strategy in place to manage mental health, you would assume that most organizations have that. There's lots of research to suggest that many organizations don't have that at all. It doesn't have to be sort of over elaborate and complex, but it is important that a strategy is there, in my opinion, and that a mental health and a well-being strategy is seen as important as a growth, a financial strategy, because in my view, they are two sides of the same coin. If you don't look after your staff, and your staff are struggling with their mental health, then financially that has an impact in terms of absenteeism and increased presenteeism and all of those things. So I think it's really important that people take this seriously, look at their strategy, and use the data, find ways, and meaningful ways, not tick boxy ways, of ascertaining, doing a pulse check. Our report is called Pulse. Try and get a pulse check of your workforce. Because when you have that data and you can see the trends, you can then do something about it. And that's not to suggest that the onus is on organizations to solve people's mental health difficulties. Of course, it's not. Nobody would expect them to do that. And people often ask me, what are the signs? What should we be looking out for? And I could list the signs, but I think the most important thing for businesses and employers is to be alert to change. You know, if somebody is presenting in a different way, and yes, that the most obvious might be that they're sort of less motivated or producing less work, but it might be the opposite. They might be coming across super motivated and doing more and more and more. And that those people often sort of slip, you know, between the cracks and go under the radar because that's seen as a really positive thing. But if it's unusual, it might be a sign that, you know, they're increasingly feeling stressed and are overcompensating, for example. So I think looking out for change is really important. And some, again, mental health, see it on a spectrum. Some difficulties can be nipped in the bud through, you know, a friendly conversation and a bit of time out. But at the other end of the spectrum, some people will need specialist support. So it's important that organisations know where to direct people to.
Yeah, often they talk about, you know, the word of the year, and I think last year it was pandemic or furlough or something like that. Would be great. The word of the year for 2021 and beyond was empathy.
Yeah.
You know, this idea that even if you've kind of coped and you've done all right, we should all be able to empathize with anyone who's saying, well, actually, it's not working so well for me.
I totally agree. And again, the CMI research was interesting because one of the things that came out of it is that it wasn't so much the sector, the specific sector that people were working in that was sort of really key in terms of people's experience of mental health. It was the way their manager treated them. It was the level of empathy and support that their manager had when it came to their mental health. So yeah, I would love that to be the buzzword of the year for sure.
We mentioned, and you mentioned at the start of the conversation, eating disorders, and I just wanted to sort of make sure that we had this conversation because it strikes me, and there's been sort of some high-profile sort of cases in the media around this as well, and I just wondered what were some people might consider eating disorders not to be something you would associate with the sort of situation we've experienced. They may think, well, surely an eating disorder's to do with something else. Can you just sort of frame that for us in terms of why eating disorders might become an issue? And you've seen I think a 51% increase in young people reporting eating disorders.
Yeah, I'm sure. So eating disorders in terms of our young cohort now represents around 9% of our overall presenting issues. And that may sound low, but it's not, and it's double roundabout what it was the year before. And as much as, relatively speaking, when it comes to mental health, eating disorders are less common, you know, compared to things like anxiety and depression and so on. However, they are incredibly serious. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any of the mental health disorders. And, you know, anybody who has either worked in ED services, as I have, that's sort of my main clinical background in the NHS, or has experienced an eating disorder or lived with somebody with an eating disorder will absolutely not be surprised at this increase at all. We all predicted that this would happen, and sure enough it has, right across the age range actually. You know, we're now seeing with children and young people services specifically, sadly, we're seeing the waiting list for specialist services just go up and up and up. And it's a real shame because the government had put a lot of money into children's eating disorder services, and we were really starting to see some improvements in terms of people getting that early help that's so vital. So how does it relate to the pandemic? Eating disorders are complex, like all mental health presentations. One of the most central elements of an eating disorder in terms of the development of an eating disorder, but also the maintenance of it, and ultimately actually the recovery from it, is control, sense of control. Now, sense of control has been adversely affecting all of us, I would say, to a greater or lesser extent during this pandemic in terms of the restrictions that we've had. But for somebody with an eating difficulty or vulnerabilities to developing an eating difficulty, where that sense of control is so important, their exercise has been restricted. There have been concerns about being able to go out to shops to buy foods that they want. Their routine's been up and down, all of these things have really impacted people with eating difficulties. And also, if you think, you know, we're talking on Zoom now, most of us have spent a lot of time on Zoom or equivalents, where you're looking at yourself all the time, body image, huge issue for people with eating difficulties. And when they're constantly looking at themselves, again, it sort of exacerbates the need to check and the sort of questioning around sort of, body image related stuff. So there are some real key issues. Of course, treatment's been affected as well. So, for many people who were accessing treatment, some of their treatment routines have been disrupted, which has had an impact. And I mentioned before the importance of early help with any mental health difficulty. Absolutely, with eating disorders, the sooner you get help, the quicker you will be and to recovery, and the better your prognosis will be. Many people have been anxious about sort of going out to face-to-face services as a result of the pandemic and some of the health anxieties. So there are all sorts of issues which, frankly, have been a recipe for disaster when it comes to people with existing eating disorders, but also those who are vulnerable. And we've seen both of those groups. So people who were partway through treatment and indeed on their way to recovery slip backwards, but we've also seen people develop eating difficulties for the first time.
Thanks for answering that question. It was a comprehensive answer, but I knew you had sort of real expertise in it, and I think it sets it out, importantly as to why it's such an important topic. Can I ask you finally, Dr. Lynne, in terms of the State of the Nation report sets out, how things have been in the last year, and we've talked about that sort of adjustment period as we return to quote normal life. But for a lot of people, normal life wasn't working for them anyway, and you guys have been up and running for a long time anyway in terms of everything that went before we got into a pandemic. So is there a graph somewhere in your office which kind of goes, well, here's where things are now, here's how long we think it'll take to get back down to normal, and then we can concentrate on normal levels of issues again? Does that graph peak now? Has it already peaked? Does it have like a plateau which then fades down? Is everything back to normal by 2024? How are you sort of viewing how things might play out in the next sort of 12, 18 months and then beyond?
Well, my short answer to that is that we don't know, and I would love to have such a graph. I think the key thing for us and providers of service is that we continue to use our data to inform our next steps and our recovery plan. I don't think anybody really knows the long-term impact of this pandemic, and as you've suggested, just because the world is opening up again, that doesn't suddenly mean that everybody's problems disappear. I've talked a bit about the spectrum of mental health, and as I said, we see people at all ends of that spectrum. We've seen real increases in adults reporting abuse within their home environment. That doesn't just go away because the world has opened up again. So mental health services like Kooth, like the NHS, and the various sort of charity providers and others are now having to pick up those pieces and make sure that we've got the right level of support so we can meet the varied needs of our population, whatever that might be. And I think alongside the importance of the data, you can't do anything without data. You can't plan ahead unless you've got good data. And it isn't just about the data from Kooth. That's one part of the jigsaw puzzle. It's about all of the data. Now is the time for us to really pool what we know because we need to be, it sounds a bit trite, but we need to be in it together. There is no one saviour here. There is going to be no one provider who will solve these issues going forwards. The NHS, quite timely, are moving to more integrated care systems. That's their new model. And as part of that, they will be, really looking at how we can sort of plug in different sectors and different providers, including digital, for example, for early access to treatment or for step-down care or for alongside sort of specialist treatment. And that's what we need to do going forwards. Use the data to inform where the gaps are and where the needs are nationally and within sort of local geographies, because there are differences, and then work collaboratively in order to find the solutions.
Dr. Lynne, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you speaking to us. The State of the Nation report is out now. People can find out more information at kooth.com with a K, KOOTH.com, and really appreciate you joining us on the programme.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.